Hello, my name is Tim Lynch. I am an Associate Professor in American Politics here in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Melbourne. Welcome to our third US election webinar, one more to go. I'm delighted to welcome Associate Professor Tom Daly. Tom is Deputy Director here at the Melbourne School of Government and Director of the global online research platform Democratic Decay and Renewal. Tom is one of the leading experts on democracy. Tom, you're very welcome to the US election series.
Thank you, Tim. Happy to be here.
Well, as I usually do, Tom, I start by offering some thoughts on where the campaign is at. And each week I've done that. Trump seems as much behind as he was last week, and indeed not in a similar position to where he was 6 weeks ago, if not 3 or 4 months ago. I suppose the key difference now is that nearly half of those that will vote have already voted. This is a remarkable state of affairs because we are used to an election where people vote on the day. And because of COVID, we've seen this very interesting shift to online voting. Perhaps we might come to that in our discussion. Our focus today, given that both Tom and I have an interest, particularly in US foreign policy, is to frame our discussion through that lens, though not exclusively so, and discuss where we think US foreign policy is at under Trump to this point, and where it might go into a Trump second term, or as seems likely, though not certain, into a Biden term. So in service of that design for the 45 minutes that we've got, let me suggest that one of the key arguments about Trump foreign policy is an assumption, and Tom can come in and argue back on this, but an operating assumption which I think is largely not borne out, that US foreign policy is in crisis. And I've argued that, show me that crisis. Okay, long range crisis from climate to the problem of rising authoritarianism. But in terms of wars, we don't see any, not those that are killing Americans or indeed Australians. So without launching into a defense of Trump, I think we are correct in observing that he's actually, if he does hand over the keys to the White House in January to Joe Biden, he's handing over a foreign policy which is not at war. And this is a shift given the propensity for militarism in American statecraft over the previous 40 years since the end of the Cold War. Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I think when we're talking about crisis, we have to take a broader view, in my view. So when we look at, the issue of war versus peace and so on, it's a very different picture. You're completely right. At the end of Trump's 4 years compared to the predecessors coming to the end of their terms in recent times. But for me, and I'm a democracy scholar, so that colors how I view these issues. So I'm looking at issues that go far beyond the sort of the big ticket, punctuated sort of conflicts that the US has become embroiled in, and the sort of military adventurism that has become a hallmark of previous presidents. But from my perspective, there are 3 hallmarks of the Trump presidency that have badly damaged US foreign policy, that have created a diffuse and generalized sense of crisis and really affected the US engagement with the world. And for me, the first one is the stark personalization of power by President Trump. And this comes with an attempt at command and control tactics, no real focus on fostering alliances, and a very transactional view of US foreign relations. The second for me is the gutting of the State Department from day one under the Trump administration. And the third is the crisis of democracy within the US itself, and how this has really hit the US's soft power, its capacity to lead, and its capacity to foster and sustain its alliances. So
Yes,
happy
that's
to
a very
say
good
more on
start.
all of those.
Yes, there's a lot there, and I share some of that analysis, though I depart possibly on some of the case studies you might use to illustrate them. I certainly think there has been a shift towards what you describe as the transactional, or the privileging of the personal. Trump has this notion, and it's very interestingly documented in John Bolton's voluminous book on his time in the Trump White House. He connects his own personal relationship with foreign leaders, with American national interests. And this can have huge consequences, because it means he's measuring the warmth of national interests on the basis of something really quite fungible and changeable, which is his own personal take on individual leaders. So I accept that we've seen a switch to the transactional. I just throw it back at you and say, well, Trump might be a remarkable proponent of this kind of approach to diplomacy, but didn't we see it in George W. Bush? I mean, he looked into Putin's eyes and said he could see his soul. I think I'd even extend it to Barack Obama. That Barack Obama's great claim to foreign policy prowess was his unique feel for foreign leaders. And both those predecessors were interested in deal making. I think of Obama, his whole, certainly the latter half of his foreign policy, was all about bigging up the Iran nuclear deal, which relied on many of the same mechanisms, not all of them, but many of the same mechanisms that Trump deployed. So how different really is Trump from his predecessors?
So I think that's a central question, Tim, because relationships between leaders are, of course, very important in sort of crafting foreign policy and implementing it. But for me, the difference between President Trump and his predecessors is when they've been building their relationships with foreign leaders, it's usually been couched in a more coherent and fuller foreign policy. And, with Trump as well, he has sort of become close to many leaders, but sadly they've tended to be the more authoritarian leaders. And he's tended to rail against democratic leaders like Angela Merkel, for example. So I just want to give you a sense of sort of the chaos that this has led to in some cases, right? Because the personalization of foreign policy and this link with certain leaders means that we've ended up with real surprises coming at us with no real preparation for it, sometimes reversing decades of foreign policy, and sometimes just changing the situation on the ground. So for me, one of the worst examples is this time last year. So you had President Trump had a short telephone call with President Erdogan in Turkey, and he basically endorsed a Turkish assault on US allies, the Kurdish forces occupying northern Syria. And this was without consulting the Pentagon or Congress. And less than a week later, he ordered the removal of all US troops from the region. And, that had really concrete impacts on the US allies in the region. And it required immediately, virtually, almost or over 130,000 Kurds to have to leave their homes. And, the international community and the international media have sort of moved on. And we don't talk about that so much anymore, but I think a lot of people will remember that. They're not going to just let that go. And that's going to affect whoever is going to be sitting in the White House next year. So, this is an example of the sort of, foreign policy by tweet, foreign policy by telephone that's very different to predecessors. And some people have started talking about it not as a new world order, but as a new world disorder. It's a little glib, I suppose, but it captures that sense of chaos, where we've all become a bit inured during the past 4 years to waking up to a tweet that just completely changes or upends some plank of US foreign policy. And that's a huge difference between President Trump and his predecessors.
Yes, you present that position very well. I just don't share it. I think if you're looking for the breakdown of this order, I'd be interested if you could define what that order is, because I think it relies on a set of assumptions which aren't always validated. But I just go back to the Iraq War. Perhaps that's receding in memory, but it captures all of the worst tendencies that you're ascribing to Donald Trump. It was a violation of international law. It had no UN mandate to support it. Bush's alliance making was highly personal, not relying on old institutional mechanisms. He called his alliance a coalition of the willing. I mean, this is a Trumpian style foreign policy well before Donald Trump comes along. I mean, I think there are other illustrations. The Kosovo War, going back to 1999, which in some ways was a model for what happens in Iraq in 2003, was again unanchored in this global order that you're a fan of. So I'm not asking you to claim Bush did everything right, because I think you would share some of my assessment of that. But just to observe that what Trump has done has been no more egregious, no more extraordinary. All right, he's done it through tweets, and he's done it through some crude intercessions, but the actual effect has been much less problematic. There's no war. We haven't got close to a war with Russia, and that was a consequence of the Kosovo War. So I just wondered whether we're trying to heap more blame on Trump that his actual record will sustain.
Yeah, it's a really important point, Tim, because I definitely share your view that we really have to avoid looking at the pre-Trump era with rose-tinted glasses, and I certainly don't. The Iraq War is the quintessential example of that sort of foreign policy disaster that not only harmed another country, but also harmed the view of political elites within the US itself. I think where I would draw a sort of distinction between, the sort of Trumpian foreign policy, as you put it, and predecessors like the sort of the Bush era and the Clinton era before it, is where you have even major policy disasters like that, there was an attempt to provide thicker justifications for it. Even if they were unconvincing, even if people completely disagreed with them, at least you could understand what the thinking or the ostensible thinking was behind a particular policy, which made it more possible to craft a counter response. When what we have is more chaotic, when it is on the fly to a far greater extent, when it is articulated without any real respect or knowledge of the history that's coming behind it and the various alliances that are affected, I think we're in a different position, because it's not really possible to chart, number one, a counter argument, and number two, a clear counter response that you can be confident in.
Yes, I mean, it's a very good position you articulate. I'm just struggling to find a greater chaos than Baghdad in April, May of 2003, and we've forgotten that. I see nothing in Trump's record that rises to that level of disaster. Would a second Trump term mean the end of the UN? Tom, why have you asked this question? Why is it important?
I suppose it's partly related to the symbolic sort of power and prestige of the UN as a symbol of our belief in multilateralism, of a belief in globalism, of a belief in us sharing this planet, as without getting too Pollyanna-ish. And for me, the attacks on the UN by the Trump administration, some of them are grounded in truth. The UN Human Rights Council is a mess, for example, but the idea of working together itself that the UN actually symbolizes is really important. And I think it would be in, serious sort of doubt that the next 4 years under President Trump would sustain the UN in its current form.
Yes, you have a much greater and deeper faith in the UN, certainly in terms of what it could be, than I've ever been able to muster. Strikes me that the UN is the primary vehicle in global politics for the world's great autocracies, China and Russia. Let me ask a question that Bernard has put to us. The challenge for the US is to find a role that is influential without military intervention on the scale of Iraq and Afghanistan. Please comment.
This is a really difficult question for the US, because, how does it find its footing in this new world that we have? I mean, one of the big questions right now for the next presidency, no matter who is the president, is, I mean, if it's Biden, there's been a discussion for some of a simple restoration of the foreign policy pre-Trump. I don't think that's even possible. Other people are talking about, restoration is neither possible nor desirable. What we should be looking at is retrenchment or reinvention of US sort of foreign policy and the US's role in the world. But when we actually look at what is promised in the Trump campaign, number one, we don't have a full campaign platform. We don't even have a separate full foreign policy platform for these elections. We just have 5 bullet points devoted to an America first foreign policy. And those include things like stop endless wars, get the allies to pay their fair share, but maintain and expand America's unrivaled military strength. So already, even in 3 bullet points in, we have some contradictions arising there. And, how does the US sort of refashion its power while maintaining this enormous military apparatus? The military apparatus agitates to be used if it's there. So that's a huge question for me. I think what it also strikes at is that what is not appreciated under the Trump administration is how the US powers ultimately rests on soft power, on the ability to sort of cajole, persuade, and so on. Yes, it's backed up by enormous hard power, but if you try to do command and control foreign policy, it simply does not work. You can't bring people with you. And that's why people are talking at the moment about a post-American order, because with the chaos coming from the White House, more and more countries are trying to work together with the US cut out of the picture. So that's a big problem for the US.
Yes, again, share some of that, but not all of it. It's significant military power. I mean, it's the most powerful military machine in the history of the world. And every president, left or right, cosmopolitan or realist, has that at his disposal, and eventually her disposal. I suppose I would just query the caricature of that military power. What's remarkable is how the US underuses it. We can think of all the instances where the problem America has posed for itself, and not least for those that have been subject to its invasion, has been a refusal to use power, military power, consistent with any sort of imperial will. So it's always trying to do things on the cheap, getting in and getting out on the cheapest terms possible. Iraq exposed the folly of this, where the place was left to be looted and descend into anarchy, in part because America refused to have the hard military power that it has in abundance. I think Libya repeats that, going in kind of from behind and then leaving. And the consequence, the price has been paid by ordinary Libyans. Trump is very much within that tradition, is he not, Tom? That he wants to not use the military, but rather likes it being there. So he said, I'm not going to use it to defend foreigners, but I'm going to build it up to defend Americans. I just don't, there seems to be at least a logic to that position, born of the experience of the post-Cold War years. You don't share that?
No, to be honest, I agree with the view that a line can be drawn from US history in how different leaders have oscillated between, and the political classes overall have oscillated between, engagement with the world and isolationism. And the US itself has had that tug of war between being safe within its borders or deciding to become a real empire. We had that time where the Philippines was part of the US, for example. What we have now in the post-Second World War sort of era is a pointillist empire. The US has 800 military bases across the world. It's sort of dots across the world. And that's how it actually extends its power and exercises its power. Very different to your old sort of empire. And the US, of course, is very anti being seen as an empire. But I think what this comes back to a certain extent is it's ultimately a democratic choice for the USA to pull back, to retrench its foreign power and its foreign commitments. I don't dispute that at all. I think that is a decision for the US itself. But for me, when you're a global power with serious geopolitical heft and with serious responsibilities across the world that have been built up over decades, you have a responsibility to not just cut and run. It has to be a managed transition back. It has
Yeah.
to be a programmatic transition back.
Yeah.
It has to give allies time to actually adjust to that shrinking of American power if you are going to turn
Yeah.
inwards.
Yeah.
And what we've seen is sort of like the abandonment of the Kurds, but writ large, there has been more of a cut and run in the past 4 years than anything else. And at times there has just been an unprincipled move back to military adventurism. So it's been very hard to sort of chart a clear course for foreign policy under the Trump administration. Sometimes back in January, what we all forget easily because of the pandemic, back in January, Trump was tweeting threats, serious threats to Iran. You know, we're going to hit you hard. And really there were concerns raised. And this is sort of, I think, a president who wants to have his cake and eat it too. He doesn't want to get embroiled in conflicts, but wants to threaten certain states with conflicts to achieve foreign policy ends. And I don't think that that is a sustainable foreign policy in the way that it's been rolled out by the Trump administration.
Yes, there's a lot in that. And again, I agree with some of it. Americans have a capacity to abandon their allies, which of course predates Trump. One of the most egregious examples is South Vietnam, where America turns tail and gets out. And it happens to the Kurds first under George Bush Sr., and then the Libyans, then the Syrians. I just don't think Trump has been any more egregious than we've seen in prior behavior. What do we think about where the US is positioned with China as a consequence of Donald Trump?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because for me, we hear a lot of this language about the Trump administration being tough on China. And certainly it was a huge departure from the attempt to foster a partnership with China under the Obama administrations and before. That was based, of course, on a sort of excessive optimism, I think, under previous presidents, that greater prosperity in China would sort of inevitably lead to greater liberalization, and that China was on a democratic path ultimately. That's turned out to be wrong-headed, especially since Xi Jinping came into power. But so I think there are justifications for any US administration taking a harder line on China. Where I depart from people seeing the Trump administration as being genuinely hard on China is, yes, we've seen a greater willingness to front up about economic issues like the trade deficit, for example. But then we see complete inaction on the crackdown on Hong Kong, on the Chinese government's concentration camps in Xinjiang. You have to have a more coherent foreign policy than that. And that's where, for me, the Trump administration has been particularly problematic as somebody who sort of is very concerned with democracy worldwide. There's been a lot of inaction on leaders that are actively sort of dismantling the democratic system as well, whether we're talking about Poland or India, about leaders that are really doing desperate things to their own populations, like Xi Jinping, and also helping, really making a point of being friends with certain leaders, like the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un.
Yes, I think what Trump has a fairly consistent line on China. So I think I'd dispute this idea that it's chaotic. He's anti-Chinese, or certainly anti the Chinese defenestration of the American industrial base, and he's been saying that for 40 years. But I just observe, I think, Tom, that every president post-Cold War has in some way been undecided on how to approach China, while simultaneously being complicit in its economic rise, constructing a set of global trading regulations, the WTO and most favored trading nation, which have enabled the rise of this power that, as you described it, has a highly problematic human rights record. But that didn't start with Trump. Trump has inherited a situation rather than beginning it. It struck me the last time I spent time in China a couple of years ago, that there was a kind of recognition that Trump had called them on some behaviors that no previous president had been prepared to do. All the men that came before Trump had this hope that if you encouraged economic liberalization, suddenly you'd get the flowering of democracy. I don't think Trump shares that naivete, and that might be part of his contribution, that he's actually somewhat inconsistently and rhetorically with overtones of xenophobia or even racism, but he's put to China some of its behavior and made it accountable for that behavior in a way that his predecessors just balked at doing. Do you share any of that?
I do, actually, because I think it would have been very difficult to sustain the status quo of trying to remain full friends with China for any US administration of any stripe. There was talk some years ago. I remember a European scholar putting it this way, that the same way as the Franco-German axis sort of runs the EU and keeps the EU running, it's the central engine, there was this idea that somehow the US and China could foster similar partnership, but at the global level, that rather than being in constant conflict and competition, that they'd be able to foster that sort of that happy relationship. But I think that it was always, once again, based on excessive optimism and this sort of teleological view that China was heading in a certain direction. I think what's interesting about this as well, Tim, is the Biden campaign haven't wanted to make a big issue of what elements of continuity they might have with the Trump era foreign policy if Biden is elected. But I think a harder line on China is one of those areas where we might see continuity. It might take a different shape. It might be in different language, but I think it's here to stay, possibly.
Yes, agree with that completely. That Biden's issue here is that he knows he's vulnerable on China because he's seen as complicit in what has happened during his 47 years in Congress to America's industrial Midwest. So he does feel vulnerable, and I see absolutely far more continuity in terms of Trump's China policy in any Biden administration. Tom, what has Trump got right?
What has Trump got right? I think we just discussed one of the main things that he might have intuited as a necessary shift, which is, a harder line on China, or the inability to sustain the status quo from his predecessor on China. I struggle with, and I was trying to actually put some elements in the positive column when I was thinking about today. I struggle to find good examples.
Middle East, Abraham Accords?
Yeah, I mean, yes, this is one of the areas where, all the naysayers about, for example, the appointment of Jared Kushner, for example, in as the Middle East sort of peace broker. Some people feel that they were too judgmental to begin with, and some see, Kushner as having actually managed to push the needle some tiny bit in the Middle East. I'm receptive to that view, but I think it's presenting some of the normalization of relations with Israel as being, more momentous than some of it is. Some of these are states that are really not that geopolitically or even regionally powerful or important. But I think credit where credit's due, it is some sort of a pushing the needle where there was just complete stasis. So I think that might be one area where I might be receptive to positive results. But I think why it's been so difficult for me to really come up with a laundry list, actually, for the Trump administration is that beyond a lot of the sort of the tweeting and so on, there's been a lot of inaction on the broader level because of the gutting of the Department of State. So, that for me has left the foreign policy apparatus really underperforming compared to predecessors in a really stark way. We have within the, by the first year in, there were almost 40 ambassadorships were still left unfilled. So that especially across the Middle East and Africa, and that included regional heavy hitters like Egypt, like Turkey, like South Africa. There's been, no ambassador for lone democracies surrounded by authoritarian states like Mongolia, for example. And there's also been just this sense of a government that doesn't take foreign policy seriously. So just a quick example, we got a statement 3 weeks ago from the current Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, on upcoming elections in Africa. And it just made 2 vague paragraphs, no countries specifically mentioned, sort of written on the back of an envelope, and you get this sense of, a government that really isn't interested in foreign policy. And I think that's going to be something that if you got a Biden win, would be one of the most dramatic changes in the administrations, because of course Biden is a long-standing chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's genuinely interested in foreign policy. So I think that's where we would see much more heft, much more attention brought to various issues, even if we still see some form of retrenchment and not trying to maintain all of the various geopolitical commitments that the US has.
Yes, that's very good. I think under Biden, certainly you get a change of tone, and some allies, particularly European allies, might breathe a little easier. Not sure that's necessarily a good thing. I think it is a mistake that many foreigners make about the United States, that it exists to serve them. Let me suggest that the whole of the European Union project in some ways based on this idea that they require American approval and support and protection for their project. Trump has come along and reminded those allies that no, the first duty of the American president is American self-interest. If that means allies have got to uncomfortably pay a bit more for their own defense, then all well and good. I don't think Biden can easily walk away from that. He might make Paris and London and Berlin feel a bit more loved, but I think Trump has established an agenda and an approach is likely to endure. But my other response would be the relationship with India, the world's largest democracy, with Japan, with Vietnam, with Singapore, have perhaps in contradistinction to the European Union, actually become really very strong under Trump. India, I've observed it and had it observed to me that New Delhi gets Trump. They kind of understand where he's coming from. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, but this goes back to, for me, what is actually a problematic aspect of foreign policy in the US, once again, is the government under Modi has actually been actively dismantling the democratic system, according to the leading democracy scholars from India. And there are very many reasons why there are a lot of points of connection between Narendra Modi and Donald Trump. They have common cause. And Singapore is not also a liberal democracy. It's not a democratic state. So these are actually issues that are not positives, to my mind, for the US in many ways. Ideally, I would like to see a US president actually calling out some of the activities that have been taking place under the Modi government, like the Citizenship Act, that has caused so much consternation. But I think, we don't want to over-egg this either. I mean, some of the new global surveys about support for President Trump himself and sort of trust in the US to do the right thing, it's quite low. In Japan, it's 41%. And that's very low. I mean, in other Asian states like South Korea, it's 17% support for Trump, but still 59% favorable view of the US. So we can decouple, President Trump and the Trump administration to some extent from the US itself, of course. But I think we wouldn't want to over-egg the positives of the Trump administration's ongoing engagement in Asia.
Yes, that's an important caveat, which I accept. I do think there is a reliance on the a kind of unstoppable cultural political imperialism that the US has, which tells us that the occupant of the White House in some way conditions the nature of the regimes around the world. And it's always struck me that that's an exaggeration. That I don't think Barack Obama, for all his community organizing prowess, actually managed to make Russia or India or China or anywhere reconceive of their national interests, which are static, of long duration, and pretty immune to whoever holds the White House. Mindaugas asks, has the Trump presidency revealed that NATO is resilient and as relevant as ever, or confirmed that it is obsolete?
That's a very tough one. I think this goes back to one of your observations there about how sort of Donald Trump had pushed European leaders to sort of take a different view of, for example, the US security umbrella. I think what matters is it's a matter of not just what you do, but how you do it. I think the very public tweeting once again and the public invective against European countries for not paying their share. I'm not sure if it's actually produced as much as behind the scenes a sort of fuller plan would have. Even ultimatums could have in the background. But I think we can't deny that it has produced some results, probably through fear rather than alliances, right? So we saw today, we have an announcement that Sweden has upped its military spending by 40%. So we do see this sort of move, but I think what it's showing is that the future of NATO is going to be more European, in a sense, than with the massive sort of heft of the US, and there will be some form of rebalancing. But the future of NATO is complicated by other issues like the presence of Turkey and what's happening in Turkey right now. So it's a complex question.
Yes, it is, and you say some very important things, I think, there, Tom. One of the ironies, of course, is that it's been the European Union which has opposed Turkish entry. So that sense of alienation on which Erdogan has traded didn't come from Trump. I mean, we indict Trump for his embrace of the new autocracy in Turkey. It comes from the technocrats in Brussels who have resisted Turkish membership. So the problems of the world don't, I mean, I'd be the last man, I think, I hope, to launch a defense of Trump foreign policy. But I would be keen to view the indictment that we level against him alongside that of the men that came before. And I don't think we do enough of that. So some very good editorial comment from some very important thinkers like Jared Diamond, Michael Fullilove at Lowy, make this claim, and it's an important claim, I think not one substantiated, that there was a world order that was ticking over just fine until the great Orange Menace came to the White House. And it seems to me based on a misplaced nostalgia for what the world was like. So let me ask, as we come to our end, how far is Biden going to be able to recreate this apparently more benign rules-based world order that Trump is apparently guilty of throwing into the air?
Yeah, look, number one, I think this view of the pre-Trump era as paradise lost really has to just be thrown out the window. Even without any leader like Trump, there was going to be some form of reckoning, because we already were seeing, in different regional areas, a turning away from multilateralism, for example. In the mid-2000s, with the failure of the European Constitution project, for example. So there was a lot happening before Trump arrived. If you're looking at, worries about democracy and the rise of illiberal leaders, a lot of that was happening far before Trump came. And this idea that once he leaves the scene, potentially, in these elections, that everything will somehow just come back into some form of balance, that is completely wrong-headed. And I think more broadly, we need to learn the lesson, and it connects back to one of your previous questions. We need to just get rid of this very rosy view that the arc of history is heading towards more democracy, sort of almost as a natural development, that if we just move the obstacles, it'll happen. No, I mean, there's only so much any one country can do, no matter how important it is, no matter how much heft it has. And I think the lesson from the sort of isolationist turn under Trump for many countries is, if we're going to be more democratic, we're going to have to do it ourselves. And maybe we're going to have to do it with smaller countries banding together. Maybe middle powers banding together is going to be more important than relying on two rather unreliable superpowers. But how you make that happen is a huge question, and how Biden manages to navigate that sort of altered reality, I think, is a huge question for him.
Yes, you've introduced there, I think, a very important optimistic realism. That there's a famous Romanian proverb that a change of leaders is the joy of fools. That simply by removing this Donald Trump, who is reviled, so remarkably hated by so many people, loved as well by the same token, but simply removing him will change fundamentally the nature of international relations and the national interests that are central to them. I think that's very worth reminding us of, Tom. So thank you for that. Tom, it's been absolutely terrific to debate these issues with you. And it will be great, I hope, next week if you can rejoin us, and please God, we'll have some results to look at.
Thank you, Tim. It's been such an interesting discussion with you, and looking forward to next week.
Yes, absolutely. And I will encourage everyone that's joined us today to come back in the same slot next week, when we hope to have a result. And some of the panelists we've had over the course of the series will rejoin to assess where we're at. Stay brave out there, and we'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.